In today's story, I want to share an experience that unfolded on an ordinary afternoon yet transformed into one of the most unexpectedly dramatic and introspective moments of my life. A moment that began as a calm and routine drive home and slowly turned into a situation where misunderstanding, assumptions, and the need for unnecessary control collided in a way that felt surreal, especially when I realized that someone had actually called the police on me, simply because I was taking photos of my own car after a minor accident. Something I thought was entirely normal and responsible, yet somehow became the reason for an unfolding scene that felt far bigger than reality itself. It happened on a cloudy afternoon when the sky hung heavy with muted gray clouds that looked like they were quietly observing the world below, and the streets felt calm and unhurried. As I drove along a familiar road with the soft hum of my engine blending into the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood around me, and my thoughts drifting peacefully as I replayed the simple events of my day, never imagining that within moments my attention would be snapped into sharp focus by the sudden movement of the car ahead of me as it slowed down quicker than expected, near an intersection where the traffic light seemed suspended in stillness, creating a split-second decision where instinct took control and I pressed the brakes firmly, feeling the slight jolt of contact as my car gently tapped the rear bumper of the vehicle in front of me. Not with force or drama, but with the light impact of two objects meeting just hard enough to awaken adrenaline. Without creating real damage, I pulled over to the side of the road, the quiet air around us absorbing the tension of the moment as I stepped out of my car, my heartbeat still racing, but my mind composed enough to approach the situation calmly, and the driver of the other car, a middle-aged man with tired yet patient eyes and a composed demeanor, walked toward his rear bumper to inspect the small scuff that had appeared there. And the way he exhaled softly while shrugging slightly made it clear that he was not angry or disturbed, but rather treating the situation with the kind of maturity that comes from understanding that accidents, especially small ones, sometimes just happen in everyday life. He told me that it was all right, that the damage was barely noticeable and nothing to worry about. Yet still, I suggested that we should take photos just to document everything properly in case insurance details were ever needed, and he agreed with a nod that reflected trust and practicality. So we exchanged our names and numbers and began capturing images of both vehicles, not just the faint marks on his bumper, but also the light scrape near the edge of my hood, with each photograph serving as a quiet record of responsibility rather than conflict or accusation. The street around us felt peaceful, with distant trees swaying gently in the mild breeze and a soft stillness resting over the houses nearby. Yet that calm atmosphere slowly shifted when I noticed a woman standing across the road, holding a small dog in her arms while watching us with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like suspicion, and her posture, rigid and stern, suggested that she saw herself not as a bystander, but as some kind of guardian of the neighborhood, someone who believed it was her duty to intervene even when intervention was neither invited nor necessary. At first, I ignored her presence and continued taking photos, believing she would simply continue on her way, but instead, she began walking toward us with hurried, determined steps, her expression tightening as if she were preparing to confront a situation that existed more in her imagination than in reality. And when she finally reached us, her voice burst into the air with sharp accusation as she pointed directly at me and demanded to know what I thought I was doing, insisting that I had no right to take photographs of someone else's car and claiming, with unwavering confidence, that what I was doing was illegal and suspicious. The other driver tried to calmly explain that everything was fine, that we had agreed to exchange details and document the situation. Yet she dismissed his words instantly, cutting across his sentence with the rigid authority of someone who refused to consider any perspective other than her own. And she declared that she knew her rights and that people like me were the reason problems existed in neighborhoods, a phrase that hung in the air with an uncomfortable weight, revealing judgment layered beneath her words rather than concern. Her certainty did not soften even when I calmly clarified that I was taking photos of my own car as well, that it was standard procedure after a small accident, and instead of stepping back or reflecting for a moment, she tightened her grip on her phone, stepped away from us, and announced loudly, as if performing for an imaginary audience, that she was going to call the police, and then began pacing up and down the sidewalk while speaking dramatically into the phone, describing me as suspicious and claiming that she felt unsafe, even though the scene around us remained calm and controlled. Time felt slower as we waited, the quiet street turning into an unwanted stage. and though the other driver apologized repeatedly for her behavior, telling me with a weary sigh that some people simply needed to turn ordinary moments into dramatic stories, I stayed silent, choosing patience instead of confrontation, knowing that arguing would only feed the chaos she seemed determined to create. Eventually, the distant hum of a police vehicle grew closer until flashing lights reflected softly across the pavement, painting the street in alternating shades of red and blue. And two officers stepped out with a calm professionalism that instantly grounded the moment, their presence steady rather than aggressive, as they listened carefully while the other driver explained the accident, the exchange of information, and the photos we had both agreed to take. When the woman rushed toward them to accuse me once again, insisting that they should check my phone and stop me from photographing another person's property, the officers listened, but their expressions remained composed and analytical rather than alarmed, and when they finally spoke, their voices were clear and steady as they explained that what we were doing was completely normal. That documenting a vehicle after an accident was not only legal, but expected, and that nothing about my behavior suggested wrongdoing of any kind. For a brief moment, her certainty cracked like fragile glass under pressure, and the confidence she had worn so loudly moments earlier faded into visible embarrassment as she struggled to respond, insisting weakly that she felt something wasn't right, only for the officers to gently but firmly remind her that feelings alone do not transform ordinary situations into crimes, and that concern does not give someone authority to interfere where they do not belong. She eventually stepped back, retreating with stiff shoulders and quiet frustration, while the officers returned to their vehicle after confirming that everything was fine, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely heavy despite the simplicity of the resolution. And as the woman walked away, still clutching her small dog and whatever scraps of pride she could salvage, I realized that what had happened was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had become a mirror reflecting how fear, ego, and assumptions can distort the way people interpret the world around them. The other driver and I finished our conversation with mutual respect, shaking hands before going our separate ways. Yet as I drove home, the scene replayed in my mind not as a moment of anger, but as a long chain of thoughts about how easily ordinary events can be transformed when someone injects themselves into a story that was never theirs to control, and how a simple act like taking photos of my own car could be misinterpreted through the lens of suspicion rather than understanding. That day taught me that some people do not just observe situations, they rewrite them inside their minds, shaping them into narratives where they cast themselves as protectors or heroes, even when no threat exists, and in doing so, they create conflict where only cooperation was present, replacing reality with imagination fueled by insecurity and misplaced authority. As I look back on that cloudy afternoon, with the quiet street, the calm exchange, and the unnecessary escalation that followed, I carry with me a deeper awareness that not every confrontation begins with the event itself. Sometimes it begins with the way a stranger chooses to see it. And sometimes the greatest tension in a story is not found in what truly happens, but in the assumptions layered over it by someone who refuses to step back and simply let life unfold without turning it into a scene that never needed to exist.